Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Anita McCuitt, and I'm the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Expert economists and world leaders alike have declared a unanimous truth about the recession caused by COVID-19. Its biggest victims are women. The Shecession, as we're calling it, has women across the globe struggling with unemployment, the difficult decision about whether to return to work, and the ever-changing plans for childcare and schooling. So what are we going to do about it? Today, we're going to give each of our panelists $1 billion and get their ideas on how they would use it to create an economic she-covery. Before we dive into today's topic, here's some information about how to participate with us. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. Your video may slow down, but your audio will remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they'll be sent to our moderator today to pass on to our panelists. As a nonprofit organization with standing operating costs, our 2020-2021 virtual events will see us transition into a paid event model. We will also be launching an exciting membership plan that will offer you access to more events, more thought leadership, and further details will be sent in coming weeks. We appreciate your understanding and we're grateful for your support as the club enters its 124th season with a renewed vision in this new virtual world. Now to introduce today's panelists. Kathleen Wynne is the former Premier of Ontario and current MPP for Don Valley West. Tina Lee is the CEO of T&T Supermarkets. Ken Boessenkool is a partner at KTG Public Affairs, and Don Desjardins is Deputy Chief Economist for RBC. Today's moderator is Tanya Van Biesen, Executive Director of Catalyst Canada. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is the toast we make back to our country. Usually we do this in person with the raising of a glass. So let's make a nod towards the camera and toast to Canada. To Canada.
Canada. Canada.
Tanya, I'll turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Thanks, Anita. And welcome everybody. I'm so glad that everybody could join us here today for a critical topic, one that is certainly close to my heart and to the hearts of the panelists. As Anita said, we're now 189 days into this pandemic, which has prompted a health and economic crisis, the likes of which many of us have never seen. And I'm sure you've heard it said, people say we're all in this together. But today we're going to explore the idea that in fact, while we are all in this together, we're not necessarily all experiencing it in the same way. In fact, of all the inequalities laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic, there's none more glaring than the profoundly unequal effect this has had on the lives of women, which is why this crisis has been dubbed a Shecession. And a Shecession is simply an economic downturn where job and income losses are affecting women more than they are men. Now, we need to layer on top of that the fact that women of color are even more vulnerable to this crisis because of extra burdens that include a differential wage gap, differential education and employment outcomes, and higher dependence on childcare and schooling that actually works. Just last week, a Polera Prosperity Project survey showed that 33% of Canadian women have considered quitting their jobs during the pandemic versus less than 20% of men. So the math actually really doesn't work. The bottom line is that mathematically, it's impossible for us as a nation to get back to pre-COVID economic levels without the women getting their jobs back. In fact, without women getting back to work. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this Shecession, but more importantly, we want to plan the recovery. So every day in the news, I'm sure you see it, we're talking about a recovery, which is critical. It's actually fantastic that we're turning our eyes to that. But is it going to be V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, or now K-shaped? Today we want to talk about a she-covery. We need plans that are real, concrete, and sustainable that can address this Shecession so that we can avoid another one in the future. Because in order for us to rebuild fully, we have to consider the role of women in our wider economic recovery, which brings us to the title of today's session. If I had $1 billion, How would I reverse the Shecession and rebuild the Canadian economy? So Dawn, I'd like to start with you because RBC has undertaken some critical research in this area. Can you share some of the highlights of that research with us?
Sure, Tanya. Thank you. Yeah, we did put out a report saying the pandemic is threatening women's labor force gains. And certainly the data seems to bear that out. In one of our preparation sessions, Tina asked me, what prompted you to write this report? And, it's because we have, of course, been monitoring all of the contributors to Canada's economy, in particular, women. And each year around International Women's Day, we put out a report. So on March 2nd, we did that. And what we were looking at is the success of women, the rise in our participation rate over the past 30 years, increasing share of household income and savings, and then boom, COVID-19 hit. And then we saw that we were really in jeopardy of losing some of these long-term gains, not just the initial shock, but on a more sustained basis. And one thing we point out in our report is that the participation rate for women fell to its lowest level in almost 30 years. So it just dropped like a stone. And so we know it didn't just hit women in terms of the job losses. Men certainly were hurt as well. However, even today, and we've had a few good months of data showing us a recovery in employment, women, 51% of the jobs that have not been recovered women had been doing them and they're not recovered yet. We look at the unemployment rate. Well, it looks good on the surface. Women have a lower unemployment rate than men at the moment. However, if you dig a little deeper under the hood, what you see is that more women have dropped out of the labor market. In fact, of the 184,000 people who've left the labor market since February, 93% of those have been women. So this is obviously very discouraging and very, important for us to tackle. Why would that be? Well, compositionally, women tend to work in more service sector industries, and we know this is a different kettle of fish in terms of the economic impact. Service sector much more dramatically hit immediately and probably for a longer lasting period of time, and that's atypical in an economic downturn. And we also looked at other factors which may see women stepping back. As we know, maintaining households, that responsibility falls disproportionately to women. And of course, taking care of children. And when we look at the data for the month of August, so we're comparing here to February when we were pre-COVID to the current time, job losses for women who have small or school-age children, about 6%. Men in that bucket, 0.4%. So it's definitely something that we've identified as being very targeted to certain groups of women. And as you say, many different types of women, whether they have children or don't have children or are single parents. I mean, the single parents, much greater damage to their labor participation. So overall, just trying to highlight this issue and think about ways that, how can we ensure that this doesn't lead to permanent scarring for women in the labor force, get them completely out of the labor force for a sustained period of time? What can we do to bring women back and ensure that that trend of increased labor force participation reemerges as we go through the recovery period?
Thanks, Dawn. Some shocking stats. The idea that we could drop like a stone and lose 30 years of gains effectively overnight is shocking. And so we're going to come back to you to talk about your $1 billion and how you would spend it. But Tina, I want to turn to you. You run the largest Asian grocery store in Canada, T&T Supermarkets. So you and your staff have literally been on the front lines of this pandemic, filling essential roles from the very beginning, arguably even maybe before the beginning, as in my count of 189 days. Can you share with us what you've seen, what you've experienced, what you've learned since January, running a business on the front lines and also with workers that are predominantly women?
Oh, for sure. First of all, thank you to the Canadian Club for hosting this session and also bringing light to this very important topic. It's been our curse and our blessing to be a grocery store, particularly an Asian grocery store for us. It really started to be very active on January 25th. But certainly this has been a problem. We've lost hundreds of people have quit their jobs in grocery retail because of fear for being exposed to the virus. But I would say TNT has been an outlier in this case, where we took very fast action to implement world-class COVID prevention measures to stop the bleeding and keep people working the front line, so we're putting food at the table. And in that sense, we've done really well, in that of all the people that have left, I would say on Shecession particularly, of thousands, over 1,000 people that have left, we normally have a group of 51% of our group are women, 44% left. Right? And we did that because we were successful in implementing world-class COVID prevention measures. So that's one thing, and I think it's a really important Canadian case study where we've managed to keep our transmission rates at a very low rate, 0.05% of population. Vancouver is 2.5 times that rate. Toronto is 10 times that rate. So certainly that's something that can be a takeaway. But it is very true what the problem that Dawn has brought out, that women are not electing back. So for over 1,000 people that we've hired into grocery line work, 60% of those people are men and 40% are women. And so women are not electing to return to the workplace, and either that they are unable or they are unwilling. And so I think that's why this conversation is really important to have today.
And can I just ask a follow-on question to your unable and unwilling? Do you have a sense that that group of women that is not coming back, is it primarily because of home care responsibilities that they have, or more fear of contracting the virus? Or do you know?
I think I would say it's half and half, because not all of the workers that left were of childbearing age, right?
Yeah.
Or had children that required care under the age of 15. So we lost several because they didn't want to be exposed. But also for the women that were of childbearing age, had children in their household, they definitely cited as the reason for leaving and the reason for not coming back was because of children in the household. The Asian community is particularly also sensitive about COVID. And so for a lot of the children have gone back to school this week or are facing that children today, I would say out of 5,000 colleagues across the country, 50%, I did a quick survey, 50% of colleagues have elected to enroll their children into in-classroom education.
So it'll be interesting to see what the experiences of those online versus those in class have. And I think we will find ourselves talking a lot about childcare through our conversation today. I do want to do a shout out to those who also have elder care responsibilities, because I think those who have weathered that during the springtime are probably, if they are still fortunate to have situations where they've got their parents or, others around them who are older, they're probably sort of mentally, emotionally, physically buckling down for the fall, when in fact we could be going right back to where we were. So I do want to make that point.
Tanya, can I do that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm coming to you, in fact.
So I just want to follow up, because of my age, I will forget if I don't say it now. I wanted to just add to what you're saying and say that there's a cohort of grandparents who have both those concerns, who are looking after their very elderly parents and their grandchildren, because they're trying to provide the support for their children to go back to work. So I think the care, I think you're right to point out both ends of that continuum of care.
Thank you. I actually wanted to turn to you next. You have been a long time and very passionate advocate for childcare and education. And yet, as we sit here today, schools are not all back in session in Ontario. Depends on where you live and what you've chosen to do, what you've elected to do, whether it's online or in person. So I want to give you, Kathleen, Wynne, $1 billion and ask you, how do we turn this Shecession into a she-covery? Do you see childcare and education as part of that, or would you spend your money differently?
Well, I will try not to be political. I know that's what we're not here. but I think we have to separate the education and the childcare a little bit, because I think there are different issues. If only because we have a publicly funded system of education in this country, province by province, but we really do not have a system of childcare, except maybe in Quebec, you could argue. But outside of Quebec, it's very patchwork. And so I would actually, and we had begun down this road when I was premier to actually put in place a system of childcare. I think that is the missing link, Tanya. I believe that in addition to building more childcare spaces, which has already begun and is happening in varying degrees across the country, we actually need to invest in the social infrastructure. You know, we actually need to invest in the program, because COVID, as you said earlier, has laid bare the gaps. And I think that whatever happens in terms of a vaccine and the physical safety of going back to work, if we don't recognize that the gaps in childcare are very real, then those women are not going to be able to go back to work. Many of the women Tina's talking about are not going to be able to go back to work because they just won't have the support, and they won't have the confidence that that they will need, that their children will be in a safe and an enriched environment. So if that $1 billion, my first priority would be to make a start on developing that childcare. I think the other thing is, we've been talking about this for decades, you know, and each province has made fits and starts, and we don't have to malign one over another. But I just think we need to have a vision federally that would pull provinces along and help support the development of that system. That's how I'd like to use that $1 billion as a catalyst for that kind of building.
Great, thank you. And we're going to come back to how we implement that solution, because the devil is in the details. Ken, I'm going to turn to you. You've been a senior policy advisor and strategist to the Conservative Party for many years, and you have advocated for the use of tax credits over big government initiatives. In fact, I know you've talked about a form of universal basic income. I think you called it crisis basic income, or you'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. I wonder if you can elaborate on your approach around tax credits and why you think that approach can work better for women, or that approach can work and indeed benefit women.
So a couple of things. One of the interesting things about this recession is that most other recessions, women actually kept their jobs through the recessions and men lost their jobs and came back. So one of the big questions is, why are governments so bad, or have they been so bad at responding to the Shecession? I think one of the reasons is we've literally never had a recession that was what I call supply side driven, that has affected the supply of childcare and the jobs that women are predominantly in. And so we're facing something entirely new. In the last recession, women's employment just dipped down a little bit in the depth of the recession and then recovered, whereas men's went down very quickly and recovered reasonably quickly. And so we're in a very different session. I also think we have to separate long-term solutions, which I put my tax credit into a long-term solution, and what we need to do during this crisis. And I think if I had $1 billion during this crisis, I would do the tax credit, and I can talk about that. The current tax support for childcare is focused on higher income families. It's based on the lower income spouse. So many low and middle income families don't even qualify for childcare if the second income earner is a modest income earner, and that's just the wrong way to do it. So I would do what Doug Ford has actually done in his first budget, which is to change the current treatment of childcare into a refundable tax credit for and base it on family income. So it's much more accessible to lower and middle income families, but I would do that for the long term. My short-term solution, however, is slightly different. I think the biggest challenge we have in the recession right now, is that we can only put about half as many kids in childcare today that we could before the pandemic hit. And if I had $1 billion today, what I would do is I would spend that money to create what Jennifer Robson and I called satellite childcare spaces to give existing childcare providers, whether they're private, public, any childcare provider that exists today, and say to them, if you can find another space in a community center, in a school that's not being used, in a gymnasium, anywhere else, we're going to provide you additional money to create more space, to create more spaces on a temporary basis. And we're not going to require all the licensing requirements that you had to set up your childcare, because your existing childcare and your license will allow you to create these satellite offices. And then I would top that up with a wage subsidy, an additional wage subsidy for childcare workers. I would do a $4 to $8 an hour wage subsidy to make sure that we can hire additional workers that are needed in those things. And there's a lot of university students, for example, that haven't gone back to school because of all the uncertainty. And I think the youth unemployment right now is very high. And support workers in childcare, if we could give a wage subsidy to them. So create satellite childcare spaces and give a wage subsidy for childcare workers. I think in this current environment, that's what I would do, even if I wouldn't necessarily do either of those things in the long term. I think the crisis calls for separate and different and new measures than what are required for the long term.
Interesting. Thank you. Now, we haven't had our ideas yet from Dawn and Tina, so I'm going to pop over to the two of you. But before I do that, any thoughts on what Ken just suggested? And I open that to anyone.
Well, I would just ask you, Ken, where you've seen the tax credit work, because it hasn't worked in Ontario. There are still thousands of families who can't access childcare. They can't afford it with the tax credit. And so unless you build the system and invest in subsidies for families and invest in operating costs, the childcare isn't accessible. So I mean, I like your idea of the satellite childcare centers. I think the wage subsidy is a good idea, but without the fundamental system in place, the tax credit's not going to work, because it hasn't worked in the province ever.
I think part of the reason it hasn't worked is that the families who need it most, modest and middle income families, have been crippled by the existing tax credit system, where their ability to access it has been crippled by the fact that it has to be the lower income spouse. So I think I would change that to make sure that lower income families get a much more generous tax credit. The other problem I think with the system that I advocated and have advocated is we try and make these payments monthly so that the money doesn't flow at the end of the year at tax time, but we actually flow the payments to people that need it on a monthly basis, especially low and middle income families. If we can do a tax credit that's worth somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year, if we can flow that money to families monthly, then I think that's a much better model. I acknowledge that there aren't enough spaces, but I have less confidence in the ability of government to create those spaces than the private sector with enough money in the system to create those spaces.
But it's not just the spaces, and I'll stop and then Tanya, but it's the affordability of the spaces. So $3,000 a year, that doesn't pay for monthly childcare. So that's what I'm saying. We have to find a way to, as has happened in Quebec, provide childcare that is affordable, whether you've got a tax credit or not. You know, it just is too expensive at this point without a systematic government approach.
I agree with Kathleen. Yeah. Sorry. I'll just pipe in here. Kathleen, I think that's very true. And then on Ken, I agree with the childcare satellite locations, but under PK, so under school age, I'm assuming is what you are referring to.
Yes.
I totally like the expedited licensing. It takes 4 months to set that up. I tried it very early on to stand up a childcare facility attached to my office. It was impossible from a licensing standpoint to do it quickly. And also insurance-wise, it was prohibitively expensive to find the insurance to be able to do that well. And so we've had to leave our colleagues very much in the drive with that. So I do like that suggestion, but there's a whole range of school year children that I think we need to pay attention to too. Kathleen mentioned the confidence that people have to have sending their children back to school. So it's open, but not necessarily everybody's going to send back. So part of where I'd like to spend the additional $1 billion, or there's plenty of money actually allocated to education right now, but how to spend it so that we can instill more confidence in the school program. There's a couple of places, that I think we can do more of. One is mandatory masks in the classroom. We have, we started with an overly strong emphasis on social distancing. The WHO guideline from the beginning was 1 meter, not 2. And that's okay. We were in Canada. We have the pleasure of all that space. That's really wonderful. And I'm happy in Ontario. We have stores in Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia. In Ontario, we're doing pretty good. I would say we're more advanced in other provinces on the back to school program. In BC, we still do, in Quebec too. We do not have mandatory masks in the classroom, and I don't want to I think we need to give the mask program, a stronger push, more investment if it requires it. And another piece of confidence is I'd like to see, it's probably only $40 per desk, but to put in partitions, just like you see the plexiglass partitions at the cashiers today, put the plexiglass or acrylic partitions on every single desk in our classrooms so that when children are having their lunches and they're taking their masks off, they feel safe. Seeing images and pictures like that through our school systems will give some of our parents more confidence to send their kids to school as they open up.
And for those who can't, thank you, Tina. For those who take a close look at your screen, because Tina is in the TNT office, and you can probably see behind her the plexiglass that has been put up in the office to protect her colleagues at work. And so I think I believe there's a lot we can learn from your experience being so early involved in the pandemic and trying to figure out how to make it work for your colleagues and for your customers in the stores. Dawn, I'm giving you $1 billion.
Yay, thank
how would you spend it?
Well, I mean, I agree largely with what everyone else has been saying. And I mean, certainly when we think about it in this environment of this extreme shock, to our economy, to our workers, to our health, and to our confidence. Frankly, that is something that we have to factor into all of these solutions. I was looking as I was preparing for the panel and looking at Quebec's system, which arguably is the one we should be evaluating when we think about it, and some of the more academic work, I guess, suggests that system, took some time, some money, infrastructure investment, but then it pays for itself in terms of engaging more women in the labor market. When we look at the participation rate of women in Quebec over a 10-year period, it went from 74% to 87%. So that's a lot of income tax being generated. It's a lot of flow through to other parts of the economy. So, when we think about having different policies, I think it is the idea that you can pay as you go is essentially. Tax credits are great, but if the person doesn't have the cash to continue to support, to get their kids to childcare, I think that does cause some real problems. And it is to work to dissuade people. If they don't think they're going to be able to pay their childcare fees, or they aren't going to be able to, how can they possibly continue along those lines? So I do think when we think about that model, the fact that it was, I think, $5 a day and then went to $7, that's material for people. And that's something that they know they can manage. And so when they're thinking about employment opportunities, it does give them the ability to make a choice, knowing that they're not going to have these strains financially to have their child in care.
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in on that quickly?
Of course.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
I just want to clarify that the tax credit that we're talking about, number one, Quebec also has this. In Quebec, not everybody has access to the $7 a day. And Quebec also has a tax credit model, which is actually what I modeled my proposal on. And the important part that I think you might be missing is that it's a refundable tax credit. So you get the full value of the tax credit, even if your income isn't high enough to qualify for the existing credits and the existing things. So a refundable tax credit means people that make very little income get the full value of the credit. And I think that's a very important component of it. And so, and then paying it monthly to those families so that they get the cash when they need it, not at the end of the tax year. I think those two features of the tax credit are just important to highlight. And the third quick thing that I would say is that the C.D. Howe Institute, Kevin Milligan and Alex Loren did a paper, and they said that if this tax credit was put in place, given the labor force participation rate changes, they anticipate that over the medium term, 3 to 5 or 7 years, this would actually pay for itself. And I think that's one of the, I would like us to think about childcare not as a social issue, but as an economic issue. And I think what is going to happen in the coming months as we come out of this recovery is that we're going to see that our economy is not going to be able to return to anywhere near its prior capacity if we can't find a way to get these women back to work. And I think changing the debate, not changing the debate, but adding the economic component to the childcare debate is going to be a really powerful way to talk about this issue. I gave a speech to a bunch of rich guys in Calgary last night, and I started my speech by saying, I want to talk about childcare as an economic issue. And I was pleasantly surprised that all of these wealthy oil men in Calgary all said, yes, childcare is an economic issue. We used to think it was a social issue, but it's now an economic issue. And I think that's going to be one of the important changes on this issue in the months ahead.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, Dawn. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, our research very much validates what you're saying. It is an economic issue. If we had participation rates of women equivalent to that of men, that generates about $100 billion in GDP. So yeah, it is. I guess my point was more just in terms of a cash flow. If I'm working and I'm going to have to wait to get money back to pay these fees, how does that work for me as a woman trying to engage in the labor market? So that would be my only point. It isn't so much that that's such a bad idea.
I think that Dawn, you make the key point. I think that whatever we chose as a nation to do in childcare, there has to be a universality to it. It has to be straightforward. People have to, whatever their socioeconomic status is, they have to understand how they access the childcare. And, in reality, it would probably take some time to phase in. You can't snap your fingers and have this in place. As I said before, different provinces are in different stages of building the number of spaces they need and so on. But I think the universal nature of it, and I think, making sure that whatever is put in place is actually affordable and not just on paper affordable, but actually people can access it. I think the other thing, and this goes back to a question earlier, I think, Ken, that you posed, which is, why we're reluctant to invest in the things that are needed to come out of this recession as opposed to the last 2008, for example. You cannot disregard the lack of value that has been placed on women's work historically. I mean, the reality is that the reason childcare is seen as a social issue, the reason these investments are seen as secondary to investing in roads and bridges, and I've been a minister of transportation, and I know how easy it is for citizens, taxpayers to accept that we have to go into some kind of a deficit in order to invest in roads and bridges, because they see those expenses as one time, even though they're not, even though you have to keep building infrastructure, they see it as a one-time investment, because you build the bridge is built. There's another bridge that has to be built. But with childcare and education, they see those as ongoing scary costs as opposed to investments that are going to provide a return every single year. So I think that is a barrier that we have to get over. It's great, Ken, that you're making speeches about childcare as an economic issue. It's going to take men to do that. My whole time as premier, I talked about these issues as economic issues. Nobody gave a damn because I was a woman saying it, and I was a grandmother and I was a mother, and it didn't take hold. So I think the fact that we've had this pandemic and now men are realizing the side of the bread their butter is on, and that they are going to need somebody to look after their children and their parents. Maybe we'll get somewhere this time.
I wish I could be critical of what you said, but I can't. I agree.
Listen, I'm going to seize on the positive moment, Ken, that you shared, which was this topic resonated at this dinner last night. I mean, I do think, to Kathleen's point, I wouldn't even say men need to seize on this. We all need to seize on this issue and see that actually women in full employment and childcare and elder care and all these things are economic issues over and above being social issues. They are both, but they are critical. And as a progressive, wealthy nation like Canada, we should have our arms around these things because the alternative looks pretty bad and has very terrible outcomes. So I'm going to seize on that as a positive moment. If I can flip it all back to you. So how do we get this stuff done? We've talked about childcare. We've talked about accessibility and affordability. We've talked about a universal system and this patchwork we have. We've talked about, frankly, we've talked about building confidence in schools and masking. But how do we get it done? Because it clearly it's hard. Maybe there is a member of the federal Liberals listening in, and we'll see some of this creep into the throne speech in a couple of weeks, maybe. But how do we get it done? Because we are a patchwork on some of these things. We don't seem to be able to work together or want to work together. So let me put it back to you. Maybe Ken, I'll start with you. How do we get this done?
My first honest and aggressive answer is keep the federal government out of this. One of the reasons we have had a problem with this is that the federal government made an announcement a number of months back that they were going to transfer a bunch of money to the provinces to help them design the system. And the provinces sort of said, okay, well, let's wait and see what the federal government did. And then it turned into a bunch of arguments and haggling and problems between the federal government and the provincial government. And I think the provinces regulate childcare. The provinces oversee the childcare system. The provinces oversee most of this. The federal government should give tax support and make that tax support more generous. And the provinces should oversee the rest of it. And we have clear jurisdictions between the federal government and the provinces. I've heard a number of commentators say it's time for the federal government to take over childcare. I think if we did that, we wouldn't solve this problem if we solved it at all for at least a year and a half, because we'd have to transfer all of the responsibility that the provinces currently have up to the federal government. So keeping the federal government out of this as much as possible, other than the tax support, I think is important. Let's allow the provinces to experiment, and the provinces have the capacity to do this. And I've been disappointed, very disappointed, that provinces haven't stepped up and seen this as an important enough issue to deal with it in the terms of the crisis. And I think the satellite idea that I had, that I wrote about with Jennifer Robson from Carleton University, and some sort of subsidy to the wages of people working in childcare, I think those are the kinds of things that we need to do immediately. And we can't suddenly ask the federal government to oversee something that the provinces currently run. Like that's just a bad idea in my view.
So Ken, there's definitely something I want the federal government to do. And I'll tell you a story in practical execution, how grocery store workers have handled childcare. First, they go to the support of the lovely grandparents that Kathleen talked about, support from grandparents and relatives to deal with caring for elderly. They pull elderly out of the nursing homes and they care for them at home, and the children out of the schools and they care for them at home. Secondly, they share, if they don't have that support network, they share childcare support and responsibilities with friends and with coworkers. We have a whole bunch of coworker care, childcare and elderly care pods throughout our business. And then the third, if they don't have that option, is to go towards childcare. And I think that's the issue that we are talking about now. But there's one thing I really hope that the federal government can do to help alleviate that first bucket. We've all heard of the term, it takes a village to raise a child. I'd really like to lean in on that village today. We in Canada are so multicultural. You can look at the stands in a Raptors game, how multicultural we are. And in most cultural families, it's a multi-generational support network. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, sisters and brothers are critical and our first go-to line of help when we look for elderly care and childcare help. And so what I'd like the federal government to do is to open up the travel restrictions, open up the borders to compassionate travel so we can bring the relatives and the grandparents and those family members that have been abruptly separated by COVID-19, bring them back together, because that's the actual first bucket that we go to first. And there's lots of ways we can do that. So if I have an additional $1 billion, I'd go to issuing compassionate care visas. I'd secure our airports upon arrival. So many countries have testing already very full blown. In those countries, you can request a test result upon arrival. We can work towards testing at the airport. We can do it the old school way, which is quarantine for 2 weeks when you arrive. And if you are worried about COVID risk, you can start with the countries that have a lower COVID case rate than Canada. Canada has 369 per 100,000 COVID cases. And there are plenty of countries that are lower than that. Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Germany, the list goes on. We would not be exposing ourselves if we relieved. I mean, we don't need more tourists in this country right now, but we do need compassionate care. And if there was some way to do that, I think we should be open to help immediately and affordably bring childcare and elderly care into our homes.
Love it.
Great. I don't have another $1 billion to give you, Tina, but I'm going to go and see if I can get it. That's a great idea and such an important consideration. Kathleen, what about you? How do we get this done?
Well, I disagree with Ken that there isn't a role for the federal government to play. I mean, there's a role for the federal government in healthcare, and there's a role for the provincial government in healthcare. It's a collaborative effort. There are guidelines in the Canada Health Act. There are standards that we accept as a country. Even in education, I mean, I served as Minister of Education in Ontario for nearly 4 years, and meeting with the other ministers of education, even though there isn't a federal responsibility for elementary and secondary education, there's lots of collaboration across borders. So I think that setting up a federal secretariat, a childcare secretariat, and actually this is an idea that's been advanced by a number of groups at this point, to put in place a framework, to set some expectations, I think would be very helpful. If you think about it, we've had generations of opportunity for provinces to step up and do this, and it hasn't happened. So I think we need something that is driven nationally to have a systematic approach. I think that both provincial and federal dollars need to obviously be in a childcare and universal childcare system. But I do think there is some advantage in having a national vision. It won't look exactly the same in every province. There are different realities in each province. But I think in the same way that we had a federal government set expectations around climate change. Now we can have a discussion about how that's going, but I do think we need now something that says, okay, time's up. We have to do this. We're going to set some framework, set some targets, and then have the provinces work with the federal government to get there.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. So I want to encourage the audience to send through your questions, and we're going to be trying to answer though as many as we can. I've got a few here. So let me start with, how can we specifically help women of color and Indigenous women in this country? We know that women have been affected disproportionately, women of color and Indigenous women even more so for the reasons I stated up front and many more. How do we make sure that when we put a she-covery in place, we are lifting all boats? We are not leaving certain groups behind. Who wants to take that one?
Do you want me to? I'll take a shot at it. I think whatever we do, whichever plan, whether you look at Ken's plan or you look at what Tina's talking about or what I'm talking about, there has to be a targeted response. So you start where the need is the most. And I think that, it would be fairly straightforward. I mean, the whole thing is complex, but it would be fairly straightforward to work with leaders in the communities that you're talking about, Tanya, to look at where the infrastructure is lacking, and make sure that investments start there, and that the work is targeted in a way that sometimes if we just go across the board and we don't look at those regional, sectoral ethnic issues, then we miss the point. So I would say whatever response we undertake, it would have to be targeted based on the data, because we have those data.
Well, we haven't even been that great at gathering the data, but hopefully Canada's getting better. I want to, Tina, does that resonate for you? You know, your workforce and customers have been subject to the most horrific discrimination through this pandemic. It's been all, you know. So does that resonate for you? What's your thought on that?
I think you know, one of the reasons why women of color and men too are overly exposed because they generally you know, are working in frontline jobs, like physical jobs, and I, you know, I've been running a business that is that way as well. And I think what's really important, like we're talking about safe schools today, safe childcare today. I think safe workplaces is a really important piece for all of our offices, all of our manufacturing plants to get in. And there's a lot we can do. I mean, we had, you know, for us at TNT, we put in early travel restrictions. We had quarantine with pay, mandatory face masks as early as March. Temperature checks, plexiglass, lunchroom partitions, cleaning, social distancing, the list goes on. I think we're smarter today than we were in March. And especially important is the communication around COVID and what you can do. Every individual, I would say that is a big success of the East Asian community. It's not just, I mean, I think the whole East Asian community has been overly sensitive. York University came out with a really good report about how the Chinese community really rallied and raised the red flag earlier than other communities, other minority groups. That's been a big win. And part of how we have done that is really committed to a collective mindset and how we engage in our day-to-day, commit to the smaller social bubbles, not only care in work. Like sometimes I see people, they walk out of the workplace and the first thing to do is take off their mask and, you know, it's back to normal. The regiment of COVID safety goes throughout all the day. Like if you, a very small example, like who showers in the morning?
I do.
Every Asian person today, I'll tell you, at least that works for me, 5,000 Chinese people that work for TNT Supermarket, they shower at night. They shower the first thing they do. They go home, they go home, they take off their shoes in the garage. They disinfect themselves from head to toe, and they shower at night, right? And there is the, you know, what I call the disappearing running hug. You're not allowed to touch your children anymore when you get home. These kind of daily routines and daily activities is something that I think we should, you know, like Canada is such a diverse country. We should lean into this diversity as much as possible. It's something that the Asian community can offer other minority groups, and other Canadians in general, men or women, and of every color. And if companies and governments can commit to that collective mindset, as in we are all in this together, like stop pointing the fingers and blaming people. I think that's going to go a long way for, you know, definitely women of color, but also men and frontline workers of all kinds.
Thanks, Tina. Dawn, I've got one for you. Interestingly, you might shake your head and say, why are you asking me? But I'm curious to know, so we have a question here from an audience member that says, is it political to call this a Shecession? And more importantly, a she-covery? Are those political terms? As an economist, how do you see that?
They're political terms. I think really what we're looking at is data. And this is what the data is telling us, that women are disproportionately being impacted this time around. And it does reflect, I think, the nature of work and the nature of the impact that the pandemic has had on work. I mean, it is where we are having these person-to-person contact. These are the industries where we're anticipating it will be a very slow recovery. And so whether that's, you know, as we're talking, borders are closed, so no travel tourism. So that's a big industry, and it's one that women are disproportionately represented in. Now, by the same token, women are also disproportionately 80% of the healthcare workers. So, you know, there are both sides of that equation. When we look at food and accommodation services, retail, all of these different industries where we tend to have to be closer to each other, so women will be, you know, because they're overrepresented, have the risk of being left behind. So I think it all comes down to, we want to ensure, though, that there's no scarring from this, that women don't, as we've been talking about, opt out because, well, first of all, I'm in a bad industry. You know, it's going to be person to person. It's going to be really hard to get a job. And secondly, I have all these other responsibilities. I think as we want to think about this and the recovery or she-covery, it is really to say, let's not let this women get disengaged from the labor market. Let's ensure that they continue to be connected so that over time, as these jobs finally do recover, once the vaccine comes and, you know, things go back to whatever that looks like, or that women can use the skills they have to pivot into new things, because we know there will be structural changes associated with this economic downturn.
So we don't have
permanent. Can I quickly
damage.
add something?
Please,
something to that?
Yep.
I wrote a piece a little while ago about asking why the response to education and childcare has been so tepid in Canada. And one of the things that I pointed out is that most of our finance ministers and most of our premiers are men right now. And I think if we're going to convince them, and if we're going to convince the population that the recovery, that this recession is different than the last recession, if we're going to have to convince people that the way we get out of this recovery is different than how we get out of previous recoveries, we're going to have to use some different language. And I think this language that demonstrates and says to people that this recession is fundamentally different. I wrote some economic pieces on why this is a supply side recession, not a demand side recession, why we need to have different approaches to this than we did to previous recessions. But I don't think that message is, we still hear many of our premiers talking about building bridges and building roads. And I just think those are the wrong solutions for the problems we're facing in a COVID world. And so using different language helps to, from a political perspective and a communications perspective, helps to convince people that this is different. This is not a normal recession, and this is affecting a different part of the population. So we need different kind of solutions for this recession than we did for previous.
So Ken, what's the language that gets through to those people? Because I completely agree with you. It goes to my earlier point. What's the language?
I think the Shecession language is really punching through. And I think that word, the she-covery and the Shecession, has gotten through to the officials. I have talked to the people around Aaron O'Toole, and they in their plan had a specific section dealing with childcare and dealing with this as part of the recovery from the COVID. And I don't think they would have had that if the conversation that was happening in the political world wasn't talking about Shecessions and she-coveries. Peter MacKay didn't even talk about that, and I think it's frankly think it's one of the reasons he lost. And I've had conversations already with the Aaron O'Toole team who are saying this has got to be a critical part of what Conservatives stand for going forward. It's something I've been talking about for 2 years, 2 or 3 years about, and longer on the family side, I think. So, but many of our politicians just thought, oh, we're in a recession. Let's take out the old playbook and let's run that playbook. And that's just not going to work this time. And I think Shecession language has been helpful.
So I thank you for that. I want to we talked a lot about what politicians, federal, provincial can do. I want to take it into the private sector realm. What can companies do for the women that work for them or the women that prospectively are going to work for them? What can the private sector do to stage a she-covery?
Just talk to Tina.
Yeah, I mean, I think the safe workplace, I mentioned it before, there's a lot of things there. And I'll tie this answer to the topic before. I think there's a silver lining coming out of work from home, which is all men have been forced to work from home, and women have been doing that and more, more before than now, or at least there has been a desire to, not because the men told us to, because we think we do a better job of taking care of our children sometimes. But now, because of mandatory work from home, the men now know what it feels like to juggle all of those things, making lunch and taking the dog for a walk and taking care of the kids and helping them get on Zoom. Like, it has actually been very equalizing, the work from home experience. And I like the tone of, we need to figure out childcare, we need to figure out safe schools for men and women to get back to full productivity. Everybody working from home feels the burn right now. And so I like the, Ken, what you mentioned, tying it to the economic issues will help to push, men and women, all parents, all caregivers into increasing the supply side of the issue. Like, we talked about a lot of those, those ideas today, including, and I think I'd like to add, increasing the pipeline of Canadian childcare and elderly care vocational programs. I think we need to warp speed the training of those. And while we do that, because they probably will take 6 to 12 months, I'd like to see an increase in overseas in-home caregiver visas. Like, it takes 9 months to 12 months to process somebody who is trained to do that overseas. We can bring them up in their, they can come, they are there. Hong Kong has done that in a brilliant way. We need to do that to bridge the gap on the supply side. But I actually prefer to stay off the Shecession and the she-covery, because I feel like it gives it a taboo to, men that really need to drive the conversation. We're not moving the dial if men are not involved.
Great point to end on. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I'm going to
Ken, you don't feel the burn of working from home?
No, I agree with everything you said, but I agree with everything you said, but except for the last piece, I think the conversation, if we're talking about this recession like it's the same as every other recession, we're not going to get through to people that our response has to be different. So I think the Shecession, just the language around it is helpful to convince our male finance ministers and our male premiers that something different needs to be done this time around. And with due respect to Premier Wynne.
Well, due respect to him, I mean, when I became the leader of the party, there were 6 female premiers in this country, and now there's 1.
I know.
So, I mean, I couldn't be more with you on that, Ken. Yeah.
Me too.
I worked for one.
Certainly need more women in.
I worked for one.
I know you did.
Yes, we do.
Great
I've written
debate.
about this many times.
Thank you. Thank you all. And we want to wind it up. So thank you all very much. From my perspective, great conversation. Anita, back to you.
Thank you, Tanya, and to all of our panelists today for sharing so many great and high impact ideas. It's clear, though, that if we're going to make any of them happen, we need our senior politicians at the federal and provincial level, many of which who are male, to really register that the economic recovery cannot get off the ground unless we address some of these women's issues around childcare, elder care, and safe workplaces. So thank you for bringing that to the fore today. We hope that you will all join us for some of our upcoming events. On Thursday, September 17th, we'll host the Honorable Vic Fideli for a discussion on Ontario's road to economic recovery. Maybe we'll talk about the Shecession there. And on September 24th, we'll host a discussion on the future of long-term care in Ontario, also something we discussed. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Guests, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and healthy.